to that, and that's why it's so socially shaped for Rousseau, pity, and can be reshaped.
And the other thing is that I heard, I don't know if you know the work of Adriana Cabarero, but she had some she gave a talk about ethics of vulnerability, I think she called it, and it was she was trying to forge a term, horror, I don't know, but it seemed very reactionary, and it seemed to be based on similar things, but in a very different way, because the assumption was, if we, in this era of terrorism, there is a shared vulnerability that was never there before. So she was comparing us in this lecture room in Berlin to a woman in a market in Baghdad, and how through this recognition of that now there was some kind of common vulnerability that hadn't been there before, but obviously there is an immense difference in the vulnerability. So even in the shared vulnerability, there is the social inequality has already made it that it's not shared at all to the same extent, except if you talk about death, probably. But
it's very interesting.
so I suppose it's it's not a question.
It's a very interesting comment.
Sorry.
And probably this question is too basic, but why do you think that Rousseau thinks society is necessary at all? And also, I mean, you talked about talking about man existing in an animal-like state and undifferentiated from nature, and then he thinks that this is a state of isolation, people can't function like a united community. But I mean, you see, animals do have their community, and they can live together, well, without this kind of society that humans form. So why is a community so necessary to him?
Well, I mean, Rousseau says in the Social Contract that we recognise the need for society amid a state of war, all-out war, in fact. It's the moment at which conflicts and conflicting, in fact, desires and passions come together, and our life becomes jeopardised by a situation where there are no common laws which, in fact, tell us what we can expect from each other. That we then recognise the need for some kind of society. It emerges through the absence of society that we recognise the need for it. Through the fact that if you don't have common laws, if you don't have anything that is in fact supposedly checking the individual's behaviour, I could paradoxically use my unlimited freedom to harm you, to jeopardise your freedom. There's nothing to stop me doing that. And so you then need to think through the kind of constraints on each other to protect freedom as such. So it's through, he says, that it's through the clashing of differences which we recognise the need for society. But if there wasn't some common interest, society would never emerge. And the common interest comes through a recognition for the need for some kind of order to protect our freedom as well, our equal freedom. Because without, in the absence of any kind of laws or any checks, my natural freedom, which is what Rousseau says we have, which is only limited by my physical strength, would enable me to use my freedom to harm you, to deprive you of your freedom. So it would be a totally sort of self-cancelling situation. But that's not his state of nature. That's a partially socialised state. The state of nature is a moment at which we live in this kind of animal-like paradise, where all our needs are being satiated, where we don't really have to enter into conflict with one another. And this is all imagined, where we live in isolation from one another. We live in a state of independence, but the independence is an absence of relations. Our freedom is an absence of constraint. And it's through natural disasters, which place our kind of, if you want, almost sort of symbiotic relationship with our environment into question, which creates this rupture, which creates this gap in our world and makes us suddenly think about how am I going to survive, which makes us aware of death, which begins to transport us beyond our animal state, because it's at that moment, as Rousseau said, no one can have the experience of death himself. It's that moment we begin to recognise others for Rousseau. So the sort of state of war is a partially socialised state.
Okay, so I mean the
war is not a natural phenomenon.
To suffer or vulnerability or danger is basically why people become more and more socialized?
Yeah, that's what he's saying. The kind of that's the beginning of human associations. It's fairly he's what he's trying to do really in the discourse on inequality is think through the transition from the state of nature through to society. But what he shows us is the impossibility of doing that, because we can't think nature in any pure form, because we only want to think about nature from the perspective of society, because it's absent. And so nature, in fact, is, if you want, the negative of society. Yeah, that's why I was saying at the beginning that it's this kind of, it represents, if you want, the absence of society, and it's by stripping away all the facts, all the things we take for granted in our society, that he makes those things seem no longer necessary, but contingent, open to questioning and change. He's not saying we want to go back to a state of nature, but he's saying that nature is important for us to have notions about, because what it does is it shows us the uncertainty, the contingency of our social realm. The fact that we cannot found it on a natural basis means that society is kind of a construct, and because it's a construct, it can be reconstructed.
Giving, I would just ask you about different sorts of limits to pity, I suppose, and cases when the claims of the disenfranchised, shall we say, might require the suspension of pity. And then another question about sort of limits of pity, which is slightly different. But anyway, the three cases I have in mind are the following. The first two are specifically about the suspension of pity. Because one of the things I should say, what's behind this is a question about the extent to which we've already decided whose side we're on before we commit to the gesture of pity, or the sort of impulse of pity towards any particular case. So we might think of the, let's imagine if such a thing were conceivable, that the disenfranchised had organised themselves so successfully that they now formed a massively powerful movement, which, far from being pitiful, was in fact terrifying. That wouldn't necessarily mean that their cause was any less just. The fact that there was no conceivable, that they were no longer to be pitied, but rather to be feared. So one possible, let's say, sort of case of the suspension of pity, but still in the interests of identification with the cause of the disenfranchised. The second sort of limit case that I was thinking of came from, I think you were talking about Emile at one point, as, in a sense, discovering that the equality of anyone with anyone can mean the refusal to identify with the dominant. And that then started me wondering about you can feel pity for us. There comes a time when you have to stop feeling pity in order to affirm equality with the disenfranchised. So that kind of pity, you have to stop feeling pity for David Cameron, for example. So those are two sort of cases of, as it were, the necessary suspension of pity, given that we've already decided whose side we're on. And the third case, which I usually tack on, is a different structure, but is the question of the animal. And the pity inspired by a sense of shared vulnerability and insufficiency, and so on, clearly is a question for human-animal relations as well. There's a fabulous, I'll throw this in, there's a Adorno-Horkheimer discussion published recently in the New Left Review, in which Adorno says that philosophy exists to redeem what you see in the gaze of an animal. So I just wondered, this is just a question for information, really, where Rousseau sees pity for animals fitting into all this. Sorry, that's an awful lot.
That's okay. No, I'll try and sort of answer those questions. So, yes, I mean, I see what you're saying, that there has to be moments when we suspend pity, because it could actually be, to identify with the cause, could actually be, if I get you right, to jeopardise communal relations. Would that be correct? So they might be identifying with movements that could be in some way fundamentally anti-democratic.
Well, yeah, but possibly necessarily so. You said that if you know, why is Rousseau suggesting that pity is useful as a passion in political terms? Because it leads me to identify with the disenfranchised, say. But if that in a sense presupposes that identifying with the disenfranchised is a good thing.
Yeah.
And if identifying with the disenfranchised is a good thing, then so is supporting their cause when they get to the point of being a terrifying mass.
Exactly. No, I mean, I think the control there wouldn't necessarily be on pity. The control would become much more in the kind of legal realm, actually, which I know is not necessarily the answer, but he talks a lot about in the social contract partial associations, and there's a common sort of idea among political theorists that what Rousseau says, for the general will to work, you need to suspend all partial associations, and partial associations would be things that we like interest groups, as it were. He doesn't actually say that. It's much more nuanced than that when you read the text. What he actually says is that partial associations present a danger to the general will only when one becomes so dominant that it suppresses the difference and the diversity which is essential for thinking through what we share in common or what our common interest is. And he says that this should then involve, in fact, what should be possible would be the proliferation of partial associations, that they should be, in fact, there should be many more partial associations, because then that will ensure their relative equality and prevent one from becoming dominant. Okay. Also, to answer your question, in the social contract, there's the chapter at the end on the civil religion, which is a chapter which poses lots of problems for commentators on Rousseau, precisely because he's proposing a civil religion, which shouldn't ever be, in fact, identified as a particular faith. It's not. He sees it as what he calls it a sort of, if you want to use sort of modern vocabulary, but a supplement to the absence of natural sociability among men. And one of the fundamental clauses of that is what he calls, or what you could translate as, the intolerance of intolerance. And that would be the moment at which you don't have this open policy of tolerance where you just identify with anything, because that would then lead us to what? To identify with even antisocial forms of behaviour, because we just have to accept it, because we've got to be open to others and differences. It's a recognition of the limits on what we tolerate and what we identify with, as preserving, in fact, democratic freedom and equality. So maybe at that moment there would be a kind of suspension, perhaps, of pity involved in those moments. But it's a very interesting question, because there's that kind of idea of autoimmunity, of emerging, needing to, in fact, to preserve what pity is supposedly about. There are times where you have to attack it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that's a very interesting question, and really very, very fruitful. Your second point
was similar in a way, that the pity as a political mobiliser depends upon a pre-selection about what kinds of state deserve my pity or not. I.e., there's a difference here between feeling sorry for the disadvantaged and feeling sorry for a member of the dominant order because of some misfortune which is befallen them. But in terms of the pitiability, neither is more pitiable than the other.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this again comes back to this point that you might have a response, a recognition of someone in a state which you see as less